All right, well, good evening. It's wonderful to be with you all. If you would, grab a Bible, and we're going to be in Leviticus this evening. We'll be beginning in Leviticus chapter 12. The series, as we've had a wonderful job done so far, has been focused on people's expertise, and we have some really great knowledgeable resources in the area. And I don't think I'm anywhere near qualified in this area of expertise as like Luke Chandler is in archaeology, but I'm going to give it my best shot. As you know, I'm an engineer, and so I obviously went to college for engineering, and my specific discipline was in biomedical engineering. So things related to the body fascinate me, and I love to be able to keep up and read on a lot of this stuff. And so today we're going to be diving mostly into the medical side, but also into just some regular chemistry and physics as we talk about the science and God's law for just a little bit here this evening. I hope that it will be helpful for us, that we can see God's wisdom in the way that He created the world and the way that He created the law. So I want to start by asking, if God created the world, what would you expect to find, right? Well, of course, we believe that God did create the world, but those evidences should be left behind for us to easily witness and see. So the first thing I would argue that we ought to see is that He would have an intimate knowledge of how the world works. That's something you would expect from that designer. You know, if you are the engineer who designs a system, they always come back to ask you why it's not working usually, but also sometimes how it does work, right? Because you are the designer, the one who knows and does the calculations of the inner workings. So what you would expect to see is that God is more knowledgeable about science than mankind would be, right? We are observing God's own creation. God would be the mastermind who understands the physics and the biology and the chemistry, and we are witnessing and trying to catch up to God, right? Which we'll never do. And I think the next 2 weeks when Buddy Payne is here, we're going to have a really good introduction into that idea of just seeing how in-depth God designed life and the world that we live in. The second thing that I think that we would expect to see is that if He loves His creation, He will protect them. And I don't mean by that you won't experience any hardship in life. That's not what I mean. It's part of the curse found in Genesis chapter 3 and the downfall of man, that there will be hardship, right? Man will have to sweat to be able to eat, and the woman will endure pain, right? And so because of that, there will be hardship on this earth, but God created the earth and the way that things work. And so what you would imagine you would see is that God gives His people the tools to be able to live in a successful and healthy lifestyle. Some things that we would expect to see in the law particularly would be that it's full of healthy medical practices, things that are designed especially for the time period that we're looking at, that it keeps the Israelites healthy. They're not doing things detrimental to their health that would wipe out or eradicate an entire society, right? Something that's economically stimulating, something that helps them with their food and their lifestyle, environmentally sustaining so that they can continue to harvest year after year. These would be the things you would expect to find from the law. And so as we go through the law and we start examining some of the science behind it, I want you just to remember that I think a good hypothesis coming into it is that if God did create the world, and if He loves His creation and loves His people, He is protecting them through the law. And so the science that we understand now ought to be showing that God was ahead of His time, right? By thousands of years, the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, we estimate to be written around 1440 BC, right? By using the date in 1 Kings and working our way backwards, we estimate around 1440 BC. I just want to use this example as one just to illustrate this point, which is the example of germs, right? We didn't know anything about germs until 1676 AD when the Dutch figured it out, right? That there were these tiny little organelles and these microbes that move through the air and through the stool and through the blood and through contact in animals, right? It moves them this way and jumps from one warm body to the next. And they learned that there were these germs Before that, people knew that if I was right next to someone who was sick, I was probably going to get sick, but they didn't have any understanding of how to prevent that or what exactly was causing that. But as we know, as you look through a lot of the examples of the law, God commands people to remove themselves and distance themselves from those who have leprosy, right? God had a very intimate knowledge of that leprosy and how that bacteria was going to be transferred. God knew about the germs. In fact, he commanded that the clothing worn by someone who is leprous to be burned or to be washed. Same thing with things inside of a house, for example, that had mold growth or these germs growing in it. God had that person be distanced outside the camp. And so God had this intimate knowledge of the germs, which you would expect, right? That he would have this knowledge not just a little bit before, but 3,116 years before we ever found out about these germs. And that's quite a faith-building statement, right? In fact, it was so much so because of these practices that God commanded the Jews to live through that it created a lot of problems throughout history. You know, God obviously had them distance themselves from someone who was sick or was leprous, but more than that, God had these commandments of purification, these rituals that you would wash your hands before you eat, right? Which was a practice held by the Jews for a long time. That there were all these purifications in the water and the hyssop and the ash, which we'll get into a little bit later, in ways that you ought to clean yourself before you are sacrificing in a certain way. So these ritual acts of cleanliness with living water, they described it as fresh water, allowed them to be washing away these germs. And when you go back to the Black Plague back in the 1300s, there's this large anti-Semitism that begins at that time point. Something I found fascinating in European history. The Black Death, which of course is a germ, it is a bacterium, right, that is passing from rats and mosquitoes to mankind, and then from mankind to mankind. It wiped out, they estimate, in a lot of parts of Europe, a third, right? 1 out of every 3 people died from the Black Plague. But it disproportionately did not affect the Jews, which is fascinating, right? It disproportionately did not affect the Jews. Now, I'm not saying that they were absolutely immune from the effects of the Black Death. That's not the case. But it wasn't 1 in 3. In fact, it was much, much lower. And nowadays, we associate that most likely to the fact that they were washing their hands before they ate, right? If they were handling something and trying to tend to someone who was sick, they would wash their hands before they put the food into their own mouth. Again, this is the pre-germ era, right? We don't know anything about germs up to this point, but God knew about it and how to wash yourself from it. And this anti-Semitism you can trace all the way from the 1300s to the events in World War II in Europe, which is absolutely fascinating. That you can trace the Jewish population and their ability to be more immune to the Black Death all the way up to this built-up hatred that is found in the Holocaust and Hitler and Nazi Germany. It's fascinating. One point I want to make, and I think this is an important question to ask. The world was largely Christian in the times of the Black Death. What kept the Christians from washing their hands? Why did they stop living in a way that was in accordance with God's law? And I would venture to say that it's because mankind knows that they are not bound by the law, that it's not salvation changing. I'm not saying that the Christian salvation was changed because they weren't holding to the washing practices. However, what I do think it is maybe mankind's pride getting in the way of God's own instruction being beneficial for them, right? God designed the law to protect the people. And of course, when we were freed from the law, sometimes we want to be freed of all of the good suggestions and guidelines that God is putting down that is and to bathe in this certain way, and why the Jews held to all those traditions, right, that God gave to the priests. We know why, because the science backs it up. It makes sense. How much more is in the law that we don't know yet from science, right? that are good guidelines and healthy practices that we could still adhere to now because God designed the world. He knows what's best for his people. I want you just to hold on to that thought, and we'll come back to that in the invitation here in just a little bit. So I wanted to dive in. We're going to spend the majority of our time on the first one over in Leviticus 12, which is the example of circumcision. We're going to be beginning there. And if you turn over to Leviticus 12, I'm just going to read the first few verses here, which is talking about the purification after childbirth. Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, if a woman conceives and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean 7 days. At the time of her menstruation she shall be unclean, and on the 8th day the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall continue for 33 days, and the blood of her purifying she shall not touch anything holy, nor come into the sanctuary until the days of her purifying are complete." Now, before we get into the circumcision point here, do you notice, again, that same idea that we were talking about with the germs and how God keeps someone to be called unclean for a certain amount of time until the discharge of blood can be healed and to be washed away? And God is making a very clear separation of trying to remove these germs from the people or in the holy things, and especially at the time, the holy places where a lot of people gathered together. And so God is creating this isolation in this practice of uncleanness to be able to protect the people from germs. But have you ever wondered why God says for the male baby to be circumcised on the 8th day? It almost seems like an arbitrary number that is plucked out of the air. But I mean, we find now from the science that it's not arbitrary at all, and that God very specifically is choosing the 8th day, and I want to show you why here as we go through the work that was primarily completed in the 1930s, but we understand a lot more now after work has been completed after 2000. So when you have a cut, right, and you have something that opens up and exposes the below your skin, there's this reaction that occurs in your body where the blood cells that are normally traveling through this very smooth blood vessel realize they're not coming into contact with a rough material. You can think of it almost like a clean PVC pipe, right? Normally, you don't have any friction whatsoever, or very, very little, because it's a smooth, clean pipe, and so the water's flowing through it. But if you bust a hole through that pipe with a knife or whatever else that you break into that pipe with, it's now going to go through the rigid edges of the pipe. As it flows in that way, God designed for your platelets, which are, part of your blood. They're not the red blood cells, but it's another part of your blood. He designed for them to be able to be very sensitive to a change in the friction. So they notice pretty quickly that they're not passing through a good, healthy blood vessel, but rather they start to react and they turn themselves almost inside out because they realize that we are against something that is rough. When they turn themselves inside out, they give themselves a highly negative charge, and they stick, and they create this web type of structure that sticks to the edge of that opening. So there would be a platelet that sticks to the edge of the cut. And then it sends this response back through the rest of the body by releasing a bunch of these enzymes and proteins, and they're calling out for help, right? This distress signal. And when that help signal goes and the next platelet sees it, it turns itself inside out and sends a distress signal to the next platelet that's picked up. And it continues going on until your body begins to catch up. When your body begins to catch up, it's dependent upon vitamin K to be able to do something about it. This is something that is truly amazing, the way that God creates our body's response to be able to heal ourselves whenever we get any type of cut. It's reliant upon vitamin K. As you might remember, when a baby's born nowadays, we give them a shot of vitamin K, which is because babies aren't born with hardly any vitamin K in their bloodstream. And so back before they were able to synthesize and inject vitamin K into the babies, there was a period known as basically this fragile bleeding period that if the baby got a cut, it wouldn't stop bleeding. In fact, they could sometimes be fatal for babies before their vitamin K supply peaked up and actually caught up, right? Well, this vitamin K is very important. I'm going to point out a couple parts of it here, just in the science behind it. What you'll see is that you have these two, what they call styrene rings, which are on the right-hand side here. If you ever took organic chemistry, we're looking at a stick figure of hydrocarbon rings. So each of these corners represent a carbon atom, and not shown around them are a bunch of hydrogen atoms. But what I want you to see is that we've got two ketone groups surrounding this active end of our vitamin K. This is the end that's actually going to be doing some sort of work to be trying to clot our blood. The rest of it, however, is what we call a lipid chain, right? It's a hydrocarbon chain that is basically just like a fatty substance. It's something that isn't water soluble. It's not polarizing. If you remember water, it's hydrophilic, right? Because water it likes, and it is polarizing, and it likes things that are also polar. So if something has a charge or some sort of anion or cation, water will dissolve that. That's why it dissolves salt. When salt disassociates, it's Na+1 and Cl-1, right? And so now you have salt that can completely dissolve in water. Well, the lipid chain makes this not be able to dissolve in water. It's going to be like mixing vinegar and water or oil and water in your salad dressing. It's going to separate itself out, and it can't be carried or dissolved in that way. And so a baby who's born, right, doesn't have any vitamin K because your blood, which is hydrophilic, right, which is water soluble, it likes water, from the mother isn't able to carry a lot of vitamin K to the baby because it doesn't travel well with the water soluble, right, bloodstream. So the baby doesn't have a lot of this vitamin K to start out with until it begins to actively process fats and things that the liver processes and breaks down. That's when you can get a lot of this vitamin K. Now this vitamin K, what it does, I've got the fat soluble here, it reacts with this protein here, which is called prothrombin right here. Prothrombin, and what you can see is that the protein is much, much larger than the vitamin K structure that we have here. It's hard to be able to see that necessarily, but this is a series or a chain of many peptides and nucleotides that are billions of sequences long, and this would be the size of one or two sequences. So it's a tiny little speck that is critical to making this entire chain, this entire protein, work. That's not something that happens by chance. It doesn't just happen that you need a secret little key here to be able to activate something quite so large that it's going to be critical to clotting your blood. That doesn't happen by chance. Rather, God knows and is able to design your body to be able to heal in this way. Well, this vitamin K, it goes through a process called gamma-glutamyl carboxylase, which I'm going to put up on the screen there. You don't need to know what it means. I'm not giving you a test afterwards. But this gamma-glutamyl carboxylase is an enzyme that's going to activate that protein that we just looked at. So it is something that's going to take the vitamin K, it's going to take some of its charge, right? It's going to deliver it over to this protein. That's the simplest way I can put it. And what it's going to do is it's going to give another carboxyl group, which is like a CO2 group, another negative charge, to this protein. So this protein is absolutely inadequate. It doesn't do anything for your body. It just sits in your bloodstream, and it has a charge of -1. And then when this vitamin K that's activated comes into contact with that enzyme, it gives a CO group, right, to that protein, and it gives it a negative charge of -2. All of a sudden, the magic opens. Now it is useful for your body. This protein is now charged and activated for your body to be able to use. Well, how does that work? You know, now that it has a -2 charge, what's it going to do? Well, as I mentioned, there are those platelets in your body that are negatively charged as well. I put positive there, but it's catching the calcium ions that we'll talk about. But the platelets are also negatively charged because they turn themselves inside out. And so this right here acts like a giant web that's going to stick between all of your platelets. Those guys that turn themselves inside out and call for distress, please, we need something to help. And this prothrombin, now that it's also negatively charged, gets in between them. And then your calcium, which naturally occurs in the blood, fits right in between them. So it goes platelet, calcium, prothrombin, calcium, platelet, and continues on. That's that mixture that you get whenever you have a small cut. That's not quite a scab yet, right? But it is this thick formed blood that's just over top of the wound. That's what that material is. It's this prothrombin that sits over top of the open cut, and it fits this web or this sieve, basically this mesh, to be able to catch everything. After that, the prothrombin gets cut, becomes thrombin, and then it lays these steel beams almost over top of your cut, which is what forms your scab, right, with this fibrin molecule, and it builds this even stronger, more permanent hold. But you never get there. You'll never get to the point that you build that scab if you don't have a negatively charged prothrombin protein that has been activated by your vitamin K. It's amazing. I really want you to take a step back and just consider how many steps we've just gone through just for a small cut to be healed. It's not something that is evolutionarily advantageous for one of those things to exist, which is part of the whole central theology, I would say, of the evolutionist, right? Is that one small change after another leads us to the world that we have now. Well, the platelet turning itself inside out, and the calcium and the prothrombin that relies on this enzyme that relies on your vitamin K that then needs an enzyme to cut it in half so that way it can then lay fibrin over top of it just to be able to close a wound. That's not one step, is it? Those are a lot of steps that have to be intricately designed so they perfectly fit together. They perfectly sequence with one another. They perfectly fit to be able to heal something in an amazing, complex way. It's something that we should appreciate that our God has clearly designed. It's very clearly an evidence God. Now that fibrin molecule, as I was mentioning, that sits over top of your scab. If you've ever worked with concrete, you know that you put rebar between your concrete to give it some more integrity, some more strength, and then you pour the concrete around the rebar. And that's essentially what God has designed before we ever figure that out. I mean, we didn't figure that out until the 1800s, that if you put some steel in the middle of the concrete, it gets a lot stronger. God used that exact same technique to be able to heal your cut because those fibrin molecules that the prothrombin help create, they act as the rebar, and all your blood cells, your red blood cells, act as all the concrete that fits in between them. And it forms this really strong scab over top of your wound. It's amazing. But none of that occurs, again, if we don't have that vitamin K working in our body. You can't get any of it to start. In fact, if you are on warfarin or any sort of blood thinner, right, those work by inhibiting your vitamin K. So that way your vitamin K can't charge your prothrombin and start your clotting. Because sometimes in your blood vessels, you will have things that like plaque and build up and things like that make it not so smooth, and your body will actually try to attack itself, even though that and send a distress signal, even though you don't need a distress signal at that time, right? And so sometimes you're put on a blood thinner to help lower your blood pressure or for other reasons, and those primarily work by inhibiting this vitamin K molecule. If you don't have it, your blood runs thin. It's going to keep running thin out of that cut forever, right? And in fact, again, as I was bringing up, that's what happened to a lot of babies before they gave them that vitamin K shot that we now give them outside as soon as they are born, basically. So going back upon this, right, that this circumcision that was meant to set God's people apart, God seemingly arbitrarily picks day 8. And this, of course, is something that, as Luke was bringing up, was done in Egypt at the time for royalty. But God declared this for all of his children, right? All of the male children of Israel to do this as well. But it wasn't a very common practice at the time. It's not like all the other nations had, through trial and error, figured out, well, on day 8, we're good to go. You know, after enough trial and error, we figured out that's not really what occurred. God picked day 8 when there wasn't a rigid science developed for this, right? And as we talked about, the baby's born with almost zero vitamin K, but as your body begins processing food, and this is what was studied in the 1930s, as your body begins processing the mother's milk and the food, the liver activates and starts processing that and releasing vitamin K into the bloodstream. In fact, your liver is actively working to continually put vitamin K in your bloodstream. It's what's going to keep you able to clot your blood and be able to survive if you get a cut. Your liver stays working all the time to be able to give you that. Well, on day 8, there is what they call a swing response. And so as your body realizes we don't have any vitamin K, we need a lot of it, it starts kickstarting that liver, and that liver starts working like a factory. It makes vitamin K, and the response from your body actually is a little bit late to stopping and shutting down the factory. You actually have an oversupply of vitamin K on which day? Oh, on day 8. Your body has 110% of the vitamin K it will ever have, meaning that your blood will clot faster on day 8 than really at any natural point in your lifetime. And God chose that day to help protect his children. Isn't that absolutely amazing? That God chose that day on purpose. It's something that, when you consider it, it kind of just gives you those cold chills that really God cared so much, because really what you think about whenever you think about circumcision in a young child is how brutal or inhumane that is, or why would you do that to a little baby? Well, because it's actually advantageous. For the little baby, as small and fragile as it is, on day 8, it is better prepared by the way God designed it to be able to handle that than any point in its life. That's our God who created the world. We're seeing the evidence of it right there. So your body has more clotting ability than it's the best time, and God chose that to the health of his people. Amazing. Just something small that we see in the law, but it supports just how wise our God is. And again, it's filling in that same thesis that we had, that if God created this and he cared for his people, the science ought to support it, as we see there. All right, we're going to go through 2 more. I'm going to be a little bit quicker here. And these ones aren't mostly medical in nature. But the first one I want to talk about is the Sabbath year over in Leviticus 25, if you want to turn over there. Leviticus chapter 25, verses 3 and 4. Leviticus 25, verse 3 and 4, it says, "For 6 years you shall sow your field, and for 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather its fruits. But in the 7th year there shall be a Sabbath of solemn rest for the land, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard," right? So you're not going to reap during those years, and he continues on to explain that year. Now this is one, as we talked about before, that the Israelites really struggled to be able to ever adhere to. In fact, we don't have any evidence that as a nation as a whole, that they actually adhered to this law. And that makes sense, right? Intuitively, how could I possibly let my land go fallow and just grow weeds, right, for an entire year? I need to eat. I need to be able to supply for my family, right? All the other nations aren't doing this, right? There were no nations at the time that were doing that exact same thing. But we understand now, and if you have any farming or agricultural background, you'll know about crop cycling and rotations and keeping things fallow for a year or for a period of months at a time, and the benefit that actually has on the plants and their ability to grow. So I have up here the nitrogen cycle, because your plant needs what they call the NPK for food, right? Your nitrogen, phosphorus, and your potassium are the 3 primary ingredients that we now have in modern day fertilizer. As you know, here in Florida, the phosphate industry is probably the largest industry in Central Florida, and one of the largest industries that Florida has altogether. In fact, Florida produces 25% of the world's phosphorus-based fertilizers, phosphate-based fertilizers. So groups like Mosaic. So when you're stuck behind the train, right, that goes up north and south, that's the money train, right? That's the heartbeat of Polk County, right there is the phosphate money train. That's what we call it at the engineering consulting firm. It's the money train. But what we're doing by creating that fertilizer is that we are trying to give the plant things that it wouldn't normally have that exist in the ground if we were to over farm the field. Because there's this naturally occurring nitrogen cycle, right? Through the rain and volcanic ash, and through lightning that strikes things, and the animals that die, and their urine, and from dead bacteria and plants, it seeps into the ground, and through water and everything, it eventually becomes ammonia, and then ammonia goes through nitrification, becomes the nitrites, which become the nitrates, which is what your plants need, right? Your NO3. Well, if you continually farm a field again and again and again, that soil is depleted of the nutrients it needs, right? The N, P's, and K's start disappearing with time because the plant that was just planted there used it. And so as you plant again and again and again, these disappear. And so as you can see here, we are, through our fossil fuels and through our fertilizer producers, we create artificial, right? I say artificial, we're giving it real NPK, but we are artificially stimulating the ground to give the plants what it needs to be able to support our food sources. And really, it's quite amazing what fertilizer does for the world today. I mean, it has completely transformed the percentage and the ratio of farmers to people because we have been able to, through science, figure out what plants need. Again, they need this NO3, which comes from the nitrates here. There's nitrogen in the air, but it's completely useless to a plant. The N2 that's in the air that makes up 74% of the air that we breathe, it's useless to the plants. It can't do anything with that. It has to come from these other sources, as you see here on the nitrogen cycle. What happens in a fallow year, as God would describe it here, is that there are these little bacteria that like it when there are dead weeds. And they feast upon dead things in the field, these rhizobium, depending on how you want to pronounce it. They feed off of dead things, dead plants or dead animals in a field, and they release, you won't believe it, your nitrates and your phosphates that you need for the plants. So that way your crop can grow. And so if you leave a field completely unplowed and let the weeds grow up and don't harvest them, when the winter time comes along, they die in time and they lay down across the field. And in doing so, you are feeding these bacterium that are now going to basically saturate the soil once again with what it needs. So now when you plant your crop once again, it's ready and for a productive crop year that year. And so it creates this ammonia and these nitrates that we're looking for. And so the weeds die and they restore those things that we need. But even more so than that, which I found to be really fascinating, is that there are fungus and pests that are specific to the plant type that you're planting in a field. So in a fallow year, this fungus that's particular to the wheat or the wheat family, it wakes up in the springtime thinking, well, there's going to be wheat here because there has been wheat for the last 6 years. And when it can't find any, they have nothing to do. And in fact, they can't reproduce, and they die. So it's the naturally occurring pesticide for all of the fungus and bacterium that feed on certain types of plants. So not only are you replenishing the field by letting weeds grow in it, but the weeds are not the weeds that the fungus is looking for, and so you naturally kill off any of the bad pesticide, the pests that are in the field. So God created this amazing pesticide at the same time through this fallow year because they die and they don't replicate. And again, as we go through this, right? I mean, no other country was doing this at the time, right? The other nations weren't doing this fallow year crop cycle. And it's contrary to your impulse to rely on your land this way, right? Because you want to be able to plant in that year, but God has actually the best interest for his people in mind. And what God says is that that he will provide enough in the 6 years that you don't need anything in the 7th year, is what God says. We found this out the hard way, if you remember from your history class, in the 1930s, what was called the Dust Bowl, and the over-farming of the land, right? Primarily in the Midwest area, tobacco, corn, crops like that, wheat, things that we were growing, and we continued to plant it again and again and again in the same field. And eventually, you know what caught up? Well, the soil was depleted of its nutrients. All it took was a harsh spring and summertime and enough pests to get in the fields that had grown up and had a resistance over time, that there was what they call the Dust Bowl. The dust because there were no crops growing to maintain or control the dust in the area. And we found out pretty quickly that you can't just continue to put the same thing in the dirt year after year after year. And we started studying it pretty quickly. And so after the 1930s, we ended up finding this out. That, hey, there are things the plant needs. And you actually need to rotate your crops so that way you don't overdo it, in the same field the entire time. God's trying to instill trust in his people, but he's sustaining the land for his people at the same time. Just from one commandment in the law, that was only 2 or 3 verses that we looked at, there is so much of the science that backs up why God said to do that. It's amazing to consider what God has done for his people. I've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go through this quickly. I'm not going to read through Numbers 19, but if you want to read through it at your own time. God has the people create this type of soapy solution that they are supposed to wash in before certain sacrifices and to be able to purify themselves from uncleanness. And part of this is that they have to take the ashes of a red cow, a female cow, and they were to burn that cow, skin, fat, and all, until it became ash, which is a pretty brutal process. But when you do that, you create the base of lye, which is the base of soap. And it's potash that you're making by burning the organic and the wood at the same time. You're developing this potash that then you would then take and put inside a solution of water. So they would take the potash, the ashes, and they would make up almost like a homemade, what we would consider soap or detergent solution out of that, and put it in the water. And this has a certain number of benefits. The first one is that saponification occurs, right? You're emulsifying when you put it in the water. Well, emulsification means that it is creating this little bubble, right, of these ash molecules that makes it slippery like soap, right? So that way it slides and glides well and helps carry dirt and debris off of you easily, right? That's what's occurring here when the ash goes into the water. Saponification occurs. And the high pH of the soap, right, because soaps are very basic, it breaks down the bacterial membrane, and so it acts as antibacterial at the same time. But God didn't stop there. He didn't just put ashes of a burnt cow inside of this solution. He goes beyond that, and as another antibacterial, he has hyssop be put into the same solution, which has thymol and carvacrol. And these two we still use even now, today, in Listerine and in hospital disinfectants. It's the same stuff that we use as antibacterials, the same thymol and carvacrol. No one knew that was in the hyssop at the time, right? God knew it was in the hyssop at the time, and he knew how good it would be as antibacterial. So you add that to your soapy solution as well. God doesn't stop there. You add even more by adding cedar wood, which acts as an antimicrobial and also an agitator, right? So the cedar itself has the cedral, that's the oil or what you would call the juice of the cedar. If you've ever drilled into a wet piece of cedar, you get that oily substance that comes out of it. But it's toxic to fungus and insects. So that's why people used to store all their valuables in cedar chests so that the insects wouldn't get inside of it and try to eat through the wood. Even Solomon, right, the cedars of Lebanon is what he constructs his temple and his house out of, because it is so good at being an insect repellent. It wouldn't be eaten up by termites and decompose quickly. So it's toxic, and so when you would take the cedar, you would be crushing it up and blending it so you get the oils out of it, so that way it would, as you mix it into your soap, act as an antifungal, antimicrobial in your solution. And more than that, right, the cedral actually irritates your skin, and it makes you have this itchy feeling that would then make you want to scrub vigorously to get it off your skin, right? So he's created this soapy solution that has this agitating mechanism. So when you're rubbing it, it's like exfoliating, right? It gives you that sensation of wanting to scrub it in and get it off of you. So that way you clean yourself well, right? And on top of that, right, God has you use what they called living water, or at the time, running water. That's amazing. Because even in the early 1900s, we still didn't know that you needed a clean, fresh, running water source for clean medical hygiene, right? I mean, there were so many people who died back in the 1800s and before by a doctor rinsing their hands in the same bowl of water and going to the next patient, right? I'm sure that you've heard of that, and how the bacteria is transferred and the blood is transferred from one patient to the next. God, 3,200 years before that, right, knew that you needed living water, or this running water, along with all of this soap and antibacterial, antifungal, everything that he put into it, to be able to create a great cleaning solution, to make yourself go from unclean, right, to clean. That unclean state, which he didn't explain the concept of germs to his people, but he made it very clear that when you're in this position, you are unclean. And to become clean, you go through this process right here. And to us nowadays, we see this and say, well, that's a very powerful cleaning solution that wipes away the germs. It cleans you of the microbes. And in doing so, you go from being uninfested to being clean. And this was a practice that was held for a long, long time, and still is, even for the Jewish people today. So I got through that quickly there in the last 5 minutes. We'll bring it back to some application during the invitation here. But thanks for listening through all the information. I know there was a lot there.